Hi, this is Maria with Aviation Ground School, and I'm here to share with you the recent presentation that I did on Jimmy Doolittle when I attended a staff ride in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. A staff ride is a typical military training exercise wherein a group will go back to a strategic or tactical decision and play out the weeks, months, days, years prior to that decision through different characters' lenses. So I played Secretary of State Cordell Hull in the years leading up to December 7th, 1941, the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor. In that role, I talked about the diplomatic negotiations and how they fell through with the Japanese ambassadors, especially in the 2 years leading up to the attack. I also had a smaller role as Jimmy Doolittle, lead pilot on the Doolittle raids that followed Pearl Harbor 4 months later. I wanted to share with you what I had written for that and talk a little bit about the purpose of the staff ride presentation. This was my presentation on Jimmy Doolittle, and the point of a staff ride, it's actually spoken from the first person, so you embody that character, and some people really play it up. When I was playing Cordell Hull, who was a Tennessee statesman, I put on a Tennessee accent and I had a Cordell Hull sweatshirt on. I didn't really put much character into Mr. Doolittle because it was rather rushed to put together, but it is written in first person as if I am presenting as Jimmy Doolittle. So, the Doolittle raid was a morale mission. It was conducted on the 18th of April, 1942. 4 months following Pearl Harbor, American citizens needed to see revenge for the surprise attack. This raid was the first operation to strike the Japanese archipelago and showed both sides that the Japanese mainland was vulnerable to American air attacks. It was led by me, Jimmy Doolittle, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Air Forces, who earned a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, the first one to be awarded in the United States. I won flying awards throughout the 20s and 30s, revolutionized instrument flying, and am considered, even to this day, one of the greatest pilots of all time. The plan of the raid was to send 16 planes, each with a crew of 5 men. There would be no fighter escort, as was typical for bombing raids. They would bomb military and industrial targets in Tokyo, Kobe, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya, and then continue westward and land in China. The mission was supposed to be kept top secret. The aircraft to be used needed a cruising range of 2,400 nautical miles and a 2,000-pound bomb load, so I selected the B-25 Mitchell. It was a bit of a risky decision, but I felt confident in it. Still, the B-25 had yet to see combat, but tests had indicated that it would be fit for the mission. The North American B-25 Mitchell is a light bomber. The raid required 16 B-25s to be fit onto a single aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet, which was pushing the limits of what an aircraft carrier could accommodate in both deck space and runway length. The larger the aircraft, the longer the runway required. The B-25 is also much heavier than the type of aircraft typically flown off carriers. The B-25's wings are not made to save deck space. Aircraft designed with carriers in mind have modified wings that can be curved, bent, folded in some way to reduce the overall size. The B-25 has a wingspan of 67 feet. Each aircraft carried 4 specially constructed 500-pound bombs. 5 of those bombs had Japanese friendship medals wired onto them, which were medals that had been awarded by the Japanese government to U.S. servicemen before the war. In order to reduce the weight of the bombers so that they could take off on the short carrier distance, we reduced the bombers' armament. Each one was launched with 2 50-caliber machine guns in an upper turret and a 30-caliber machine gun in the nose. But I decided to leave fake guns in the tail to hopefully deter fighters from coming up on the B-25s in the 6 o'clock position. We set off on the carrier, and at 7:38 on the morning of the day that we were supposed to go on the raid, the 18th of April, the task force was still about 650 nautical miles from Japan, but it was sighted by a Japanese picket boat, the Nitomaru, which radioed an attack warning to Japan before we sunk it from the USS Hornet. I had to make a game time decision, and I decided to launch the B-25s immediately, 10 hours early and still 170 nautical miles further from Japan than we had initially planned. Our aircraft only had 467 feet of takeoff distance. None of the pilots, myself included, had ever taken off from a carrier before. But we all were able to get off the carrier, and we began towards Japan. We began arriving over Tokyo around noon, 6 hours after the launch, and climbed from the low distance we'd been flying over the water to 1,500 feet. We bombed 10 military and industrial targets. Although some of the B-25s encountered light anti-aircraft fire and a few enemy fighters over Japan, no one was shot down. 15 of the 16 aircraft then proceeded as planned southwest off the southeastern coast of Japan and across the East China Sea towards eastern China. One of the B-17s was extremely low on fuel and instead headed to the Soviet Union instead of being forced to ditch somewhere in the Chinese Sea. They landed in Vladivostok and the crew was taken prisoner. They then escaped within the year. The other 15 aircraft reached the Chinese coast after 13 hours of flight and crash landed or the crews bailed out. The crews then linked up after the bailout and were helped to get through Japanese lines by Chinese guerrillas and American missionary named John Birch. That mission ended up being the longest ever flown in the entirety of the war by the B-25, averaging 2,250 nautical miles, which is about 4,000 kilometers. Of the 80 men named the Doolittle Raiders, 73 survived. 7 crew members lost their lives, 4 as a result of being captured and murdered by the Japanese, and 3 during the crash landing or bailout. One of those 16 pilots that I want to highlight was Charles Ross Greening, who designed the new bomb sight for the mission, since the famed Norden bomb sight wouldn't work because we would be flying at such a low level. Greening was shot down later in the war when he was in the European theater and was interned as a POW at Stalag Luft 1. There he taught art classes and actually came up with this famous design of the B-17 Flying Fortress, which we see turning a castle fortress into the tail end of the B-17. Back to 1942, I believed that the loss of all the aircraft, because none were salvaged, and the fact that we had launched them so early would lead to me being court-martialed. Instead, I received the Medal of Honor from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the White House for planning and leading the raid on Japan. Looking historically, the Doolittle raid is viewed as a major morale-building victory for the United States. The damage done to the Japanese war industry, admittedly, was rather minor, but the raid showed the Japanese that their homeland was vulnerable to attack and forced them to withdraw from several frontline fighter units in Pacific war zones for homeland defense. Significantly, the Japanese commanders considered the raid deeply embarrassing, and their attempt to close that perceived gap in the Pacific is actually what led to the decisive American victory at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. Although I did Jimmy Doolittle's presentation as an addition to the one that I had already prepared that was a lot longer than the one that I just shared with you, I really enjoyed being able to learn more about the raid and also step a little bit into Mr. Doolittle's shoes. I learned a lot about his historical background that I hadn't known. I didn't know that he was raised in Nome, Alaska. I didn't know that he got the first doctorate in aeronautical engineering. I didn't know that he was a boxer. So I was able to learn really fascinating things about him as an individual, which is really the purpose of the staff ride. Through doing this staff ride, we hear a lot about who these people were and why they made the decisions that they did, things that you wouldn't hear in something that just looks at tactics and strategy. For instance, we hear a lot about the Japanese commanders and how a lot of their parents being samurais actually led to their ideas of how a war should be conducted and some of the failures strategically that they encountered later in the war. We heard from the American people about why, for instance, General Short decided to put all of the aircraft together on the runway just before the attack, which led the airplanes being very vulnerable and being destroyed at a rate much higher than should have happened if they had been in hangars. So we hear all these interesting little bits of information that are very personal and that are very much linked to the individuals that we're speaking about. Part of the point of the staff ride is to eliminate some of the historical bias that often comes with studying wartime decisions. For instance, on the American side, on the day of September 7th, there were a lot of breakdowns in communication that, in hindsight, seem so clearly solvable, and you're just wondering how on earth did they miss this. But then when you work through it chronologically as your character, you're actually able to understand exactly how they missed this or what factors led to that decision being made, which really helps us consider moving forward how we could eliminate those issues in the future. I appreciate you all tuning in for this abbreviated staff ride briefing, and maybe it'll change the way that you look at the next historical event or figure that you're studying. Until next time, keep following Aviation Ground School for more airplane-related content.